for me here. Got it, recording in progress. So for the third time, good afternoon. My name is Jasmeer Basi. Please feel free to call me Jazz. I am based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. So as I was saying, my afternoon is starting, but from those dialing in on the East Coast, you are well into the afternoon and well into the presentation, all of the ones that we've had attended for today. I want to thank Lyra for a moment just to offer the platform for me to be able to speak on the subject matter that we will be diving into together for the next hour or so. Prior to beginning our conversation topic, I would like to just go ahead and introduce myself. So please call me Jazz. As I said, my name is Jasmeer Basi Full. Who I am a career civil servant, a proud federal sector government employee. I started off my career at the Department of Labor and Investigations, and that's where I discovered an absolute passion for all things labor and employment relations and how employees feel valued and respected in the workplace, which is really the spirit of which drove my study here today that I will be talking about. After that, I went on to work at the USDA OIG. I served as commissioner for the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service for a while as a mediator, and now currently I'm serving in the USDA within the Department of Employment and Labor Relations. And what I have found that whether we are working in a virtual space or whether we are working in an office, the desire to feel comfortable in a workspace, to ensure that your values are being honored, to ensure that you feel respected and that you have a safe space in order to voice your concerns. These carry over whether we are in a virtual space or physically located in an office. And what I'd like to do is start off the presentation with an icebreaker of sorts. How many faces do you see? And I'm going to just take a minute and have you count, and then I'll come back after 20 seconds. All right, so I am back. Kept account. Someone I know saw 5 faces. I myself saw about 9. I see here in the chat, some folks saw 6, some folks saw 9. Believe it or not, I saw somebody who saw 12 faces. To this day, I'm not quite sure where the 12 comes from, but here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if you can see my arrow, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm not quite sure where the 12 come in, but if you do see 12, let me know. And the reason for this icebreaker is how often do we work in our workspaces, show up to meetings, whether we are supervisors or colleagues, whatever your status may be at work, we are all contributing to this mission of this agency, but how often do we feel unseen? This icebreaker shows that in a sea of faces, you may recognize 1 or 2 individuals, but did you have an opportunity to scan the room at large? Did you have an opportunity to acknowledge the diversity of the workforce that is present in that meeting and all of those needs that need to be accommodated, all of those voices that need to be listened to? Now, in a physical space, you have the privilege of being able to see people. So maybe it makes it a little bit easier. But in a virtual space, how many times do faces often get lost? Especially if, for a variety of reasons, people may not want to sign on camera, or it's a phone conversation, or people don't have equity of resources, so they're dialing in, or they maybe miss a meeting because they don't have opportunities to those technological tools that would make their job place a lot more comfortable. So the purpose of this is evaluating successful practices within virtual teams for the federal sector. So essentially, the overarching question that I had in my mind was, what impact does technology have on an organization's virtual team? Because whether you are in the public, private, or federal sector, traditionally, organizations might see new technology as a way to improve customer communication models or team communication models, bridge gaps, bring people closer together across the nation, or maybe even increase the efficiency of data analytics. But what does technology have? What impact does it have on a virtual team? As we continue to adapt these new technologies into our daily operations, there continues to be a need not only for technical training, but also leadership training, referred to as e-leadership, and how to specifically adapt it within a virtual setting. And so when I said I dived into a study, is as a federal sector employee, I was also involved in a graduate program. And as a part of this graduate program, one of the conversations and requirements was to perform a study, original research. And I spoke to earlier about my love for labor and employment relations. So really, I started saying, you know, I've been having a lot of conversations with federal sector employees across all different agencies that exist, from just about every level of service, every GS scale that you can think of. And I've been hearing comments here and there on what works and what doesn't work, but how great would it be to get involved and just conduct a more of a formal study and really do a interview and a survey and get voices and a little bit more concrete data. So that's what was driving this. And it was really just to explore these participant views on what were their experiences associated with working in a virtual team. I wanted them to identify the skills that were lacking, either they themselves lacked or that their e-leaders lacked, and highlight maybe also ways in which that they independently worked to enhance their own virtual skills, maybe something that they didn't gain in the workforce. And what I did was I used a basic qualitative study, and I interviewed about a total of 25 federal government employees from 5 different federal agencies, and I got 100% participation rate. And I found these folks by reaching out to a networking association specifically for federal employees. So that's how I was able to get permissions and get participants and interviewees. And then after I collected their responses, I conducted a content analysis and generated emergent themes to identify all of the categories, which we're going to be talking about before. So the nature of this study and what I hope to do with it is to commit itself to equipping government employees with the necessary skills and knowledge. As a part of that mission, presenting at this conference, I hope, is a small part in achieving that, and just educating different agencies on what it is that federal government employees are specifically seeking within the virtual teams that they're working in. And this study was actually started before COVID-19. I had no idea that there would be a pandemic and how it would impact how federal government employees were showing up to work. So it was interesting starting this at the beginning and seeing how the responses changed as we moved forward through the interviews. So a main challenge that employees have of the 25 responses across 5 different agencies is that challenges arise when employees are expected to navigate these additional relationship building activities through a digital medium that would not be present in a traditional setting. So for example, employees are often working with virtual teams from colleagues across the nation, right? And in person, you may see nonverbal body language or verbal cues and have those opportunities, whether it's at a break or a coffee shop, to to start building and collaborating on those relationships. But virtually, you may not be afforded those opportunities because folks are typically signing on maybe a couple of minutes before. We've heard of Zoom fatigue. You might have seen those memes out there on the awkward silences that occur for the couple of minutes before everybody is signing on or signing off. And what participants have shown is that there is an increasing need for flexibility on how to build a collection of useful strategies for networking specifically. So one of the feedbacks that I received was, how do we engage in that playful banter, that networking? How do we take advantage of those opportunities that don't necessarily exist because we're not interfacing with folks before and after and during? So some of that natural relationship development building is starting to disappear, which is a frustration, which was one of the main problems of the study highlighted. Now, in order to understand, generally speaking, how do we function effectively in virtual teams, there's 5 different theories that I looked at, because we also have to speak to diversity and equity of resources, right? So if folks are saying that relationship and development building isn't occurring, diversity and equity of resources certainly play into the networking aspect. So if you look at group dynamics theory, it's saying that the findings still hold true for in-person groups, the same as virtual groups. You have 5 stages of team building. And just generally, if we talk about, forming, storming, norming. And if you have questions at the end of that, I'm happy to answer online. I just don't want to get too much bogged down into the theory of this. But generally, the first stage of group development building is you have those varying levels of confusion or uncertainty and how it impacts group cohesion. So the group hasn't commenced yet. And the forming stage is now you're documenting the expectations of what folks need to go through and detailing the purpose of the group or theory. So as a leader who's a part of this virtual team, you still should go through the mechanics of a traditional group dynamics and engaging in all of these 5 steps to see what is going to make it function. Even though it's virtual, it's the same expectations still apply. Now, I've used the word virtual team quite often. You may be wondering, Jasmeer, how do you even define what a virtual team is? So virtual teams are similar to traditional teams if you're thinking of the definition. However, the exception of the fact that they're occurring within a digital environment, with all team members interacting within a digital medium as opposed to the face-to-face interaction. The folks that I spoke to, the 25 participants, they had initially started off working as a part of virtual teams, maybe as 50% of their duties, but it moved to 100% as COVID hit. So it's not continuing with the definition of virtual teams. It's not the method of interaction that's different, but it also comes with the nature of trust in other team members, differences in group styles, and how do we establish trust in virtual teams? What studies have found is that overcoming those trust barriers can prove to be more challenging in a virtual setup. Now, e-leadership, fascinating. It specifically speaks to the fact that while there are traditional leadership models within your organization, e-leaders still need to have an understanding of all of those leadership models and adapt it to their team to understand and identify the best ways to facilitate optimal levels of achievement within the team. So for example, servant leadership can still exist within the virtual space, within the e-leadership platform, right? Because as a servant leader, you have to dive in, show by example, show by doing that you are one of the team and you're ready to dive in and get your hands dirty. So all leadership models are still applicable, but it's up to the leader or supervisor to analyze what's going to be most applicable to the team. Maybe transactional or bureaucratic leadership may not be the best fit, and you have to show more examples or have more phone conversations and connect more and build those relationships. Speaking to the diversity and equity piece, on how to effectively create virtual teams, people found that in power structures, traditional power structures, women and minorities were typically underrepresented in leadership roles. And female leaders specifically preferred leaders that were more participatory and relational, and placed an emphasis on reciprocity and responsibility towards others. So if you have that, and if you've taken time to understand what it is that perhaps the females in the group value, studies have shown that that is one leadership style that works for them. And vice versa. Some studies have shown that women and minorities in particular place high emphasis and value on working in virtual teams because they have found that there is a higher level of women and minorities leading virtual teams and more opportunities for leadership positions. So isolated studies have shown that diversity in some cases can increase and afford more networking opportunities and roles for leadership for participant groups that may not have been considered as much in the past due to politics and different gender dynamics. So we've talked about the population sample. And what I do want to clarify is that of those folks that I interviewed, the members were not in the same location, and the communication tools did vary, but everyone did have access to a computer, access to a phone. They typically used digital forums for meeting. Federal government prefers MS Teams, so quite a few folks were using MS Teams, a smaller sample using Zoom, WebEx, some of the other facilities out there. And a lot of people said that they used a combination of documenting via email and then following up via phone call. So it was a well-rounded effort to use all different types of technology in order to accomplish the mission of communicating with their e-leaders on what the expectations were. Now, of course, it varies. Some people prefer email to phone call, etc. So the amounts in which people use these tools vary just based on personal preferences. And the instrumentation, first I used a survey to determine, gather data from the beyond the 25 folks who had responded back to see what their work status looked like. And after I received all of these sample responses back, then I used the sampling interviews to ask and clarify further questions to get an idea of a narrative of their team members and their perceptions. So that's how I ultimately decided on which 25 would be interviewed, casting out a broad survey beforehand and then whittling it down and choosing the 25 folks for the sampling interviews. So I do want to ensure folks here that the instrument, and you may be wondering, well, Jasmeer, how accurate was your interview tool that it was created? It was tested ahead of time with the professors and who were involved in guiding me through the study. So it was field tested to ensure accuracy of the data collection and make sure that it truly collected what it was intended to measure. No data was collected during the field test that was used in the completion of the study. And all data is confidential, and anything that's irrelevant has been discarded. And folks, of course, were told that their information and their identity would remain confidential, meaning none of the information that they shared with me was revealed to their networking association, their agencies, their supervisors, etc. So it was a completely confidential space, thus affording them the highest level of assurances and hopefully putting them at ease and being able to feel comfortable to share their true perspectives. All right. Some of the limitations of the study that I would like to speak to is that it did exclude local, state, and government employees, meaning that these perspectives that I'm speaking about on working successfully in virtual teams, they are all very specific to just federal sector employees, 25 federal sector employees within the federal space. So while I think some lessons may carry over, it may not be representative of, especially everyone has their own structure, state, county, government. And all participants were informed that the study is entirely voluntary and that they can leave at any time without penalty. So, and they weren't compensated for their time also. So it was a free will. And of course, their consent was given beforehand, asked before the interview, told that they could leave at any time, but all 100% of the folks decided to stay and complete the interview. Now, I mentioned that there were 25 folks with a 100% response rate. You may be curious to know, well, where did they work? Because the federal government is so broad. I imagine someone who conducts investigations is very different from someone who's a biological scientist, right? So the participants who are represented were members of the Human Resources Department. We had some research and development folks, so some social scientists. We did have some investigations folks, and we had some economists. And the descriptive statistics gathered in the next slide are going to show you the gender, age, and education level for these employees. All right, so we had, of the 25 participants that were interviewed, we had 13 females, we had 12 males, 20% were between the ages of 40 to 49, 40% were between the ages of 50 to 59, and then the other 40% were above 60. For education level, 10% had some college degree or no college degree, 10% held an associate's degree, 20% held a bachelor's degree, and 50% held a master's degree. As far as employment status, 100% worked 40 plus hours a week. And I asked if they were in a supervisory or in a non-supervisory position. 20% were e-leaders, meaning they had some managerial role in making sure that they were guiding employees, assigning work assignments, directing work, the flow of work, understanding what the business needs were. And then 80% were non-e-leaders. One moment, folks. Having a slight technical glitch here. All right, and some of the questions that were asked of these participants. Remember, I had mentioned that they had the opportunity to interview and leave as, of their own accord, but all 100% chose to stay in this confidential space and answer the questions. And the questions were the following: in your past experiences working in a virtual team, what did that dynamics of your virtual team look like in relation to your age, your gender, the city you were located, your profession? What was the physical location of your team members? And what was the level of technological support that you received? Then some follow-up questions were, of those factors that I just mentioned, what was the initial construction of the virtual team? So I asked, were the teams assigned? Did you opt to participate in a virtual team? Or were you directed to participate in a platform? So voluntary versus being voluntold by their boss that this is a mechanism through which you have to work. Did that approach work well for you? Why or why not? When you were within the virtual team, did you set up your own role or were those roles assigned to you? What would you have changed about the role? Meaning, would you have preferred your e-leader to assign roles or for you to choose roles? And then thereafter, I did ask additional questions as well as a part of this whole interview spectrum. And the other interview questions addressed asking them to tell me about their professional background, their experience with technology integration, how they define technology, how they defined a virtual team. I did ask e-leaders to tell me about their leadership philosophy, describing how they communicated with their team and their relationship with their team. And then the non-e-leaders, I asked, how does the leader establish performance expectations? What were some successes and challenges that they encountered while working within virtual teams? How was conflict managed within virtual teams? And did they prefer working on a virtual team? So the qualitative findings came out varied, but what I would like to do is, you've seen the data, but now I would like to share with you the narrative responses that folks came back with and the common themes that we found. So to the first question on the past experiences, 100% of the participants had experience working in virtual teams pre-COVID. Everyone mentioned that they did have the technological tools that they needed. However, there was a high complaint level in the quality of technological tools. Folks were saying that their computers were often outdated or slow. They felt that if they had technology that worked faster, they would probably be able to do their job more efficiently. And folks also stated that the response of the tech team, say their tool that they were working on broke down, whether it's their cell phone or their computer's frozen, they were left in a bind where all of a sudden they can no longer perform the duties, especially moving towards COVID, where there was a mandatory telework, maximum telework policy in place, where they were stressed out because for the 1 or 2 days where they may not have their tools with them because they're shipping it out to tech and waiting for it to come back, they're left either to use their personal devices. In some cases, people felt like they had to take personal day off because they couldn't really be productive in the workplace, or folks didn't like using their personal devices in order to have to do their job because of concern over whether or not the work that they were producing on their personal laptop would make their personal laptop subject to, if someone was requesting information through a FOIA or something like that. So all of the legal ramifications. With that being said, the majority of folks who were interviewed said that they were told to work in a virtual team. So there were less volunteers and more folks who were told, especially, with COVID, once again, maximum telework. So that's what made this unique here. With that being said, although they were told to work in a telework environment, the majority represented the fact that they had a surprisingly positive experience. They stated that they thought it would be clunky. However, they found that the freedom of being able to meet folks across the nation that they otherwise would not have had access to was incredibly empowering. Now, an important distinction I will make is that some folks felt like when they were working from home, their home space was not conducive to productivity. So in some rare occurrences, some folks were able to work out agreements with supervisors in some instances where they were able to go into the office maybe 1 day a week. They were the only one there, and use their workspace to be able to get some of those things done that required access to printer, maybe faster internet. And those folks who were able to make those arrangements said, I felt less anxious because I knew I was able to go in this one day a week and get all my printing done. And that's just really hard at home, Jasmeer. I don't have the space. I don't have the tools. It's a hassle running out of ink, and I'm a pen to paper kind of person. So for those who expressed those frustrations but had an outlet and were able to get it addressed, reported significantly more satisfaction levels versus those who spoke to their e-leaders that they did not have a workspace at home that was conducive to working, but vice versa, there was no alternative solution available to them, reported a significantly lower satisfaction of working within a workspace. And the initial construction of these virtual teams, I found that it was on average 1 leader to no more than 4 or 5 members. I did not experience any groups of teams larger than maybe 5, 6 was a max. I noticed when it got to maybe teams of 5, those tended to be more departmental meetings, and 2 leaders were typically assigned, at least from the sample that I spoke with. And then moving forward to the implications, well, going back to the qualitative findings, some of the other conversation pieces that I got were concerns about the e-leadership. So from the e-leadership angle, supervisors were thinking, hey, I'm in a virtual team. Employees have the ability to reach out to me to ask questions, but a lot of the frustrations occurred from employees because it felt like their supervisors as e-leaders weren't being interactive. So I had a supervisor say, I send out a blanket email to all my employees. Here's XYZ that they need to complete. It's up to them to follow up with me on what their needs are. And then I had another supervisor say, well, email, everything is documented. So actually I am not calling anybody. I'm not engaging in phone conversations because it's been said, it's been done, it's crystal clear. I think verbal conversations can be confusing. I had another e-leader say, well, I also don't want to seem like I'm micromanaging. So they were hesitant to engage in more than one method of communication. So if they called, they wouldn't email. If they sent an MS Teams message, they wouldn't text message. So engaging in one method of communication they felt was fine, but they felt it might be more micromanaging in doing certain types. I did have one manager on the flip side say, you know what, I just feel like I need to be tuned in more because I feel pressure to make sure that my employees are being productive. And when we're home, I know for me personally, there's more distractions. So I feel like maybe I need to be on my employees more to make sure that the work is being done. Especially for those employees that I worked with in person, I already was having some conflict with them in making sure that the productivity was being met. Now, on the flip side, you have the employees saying, this one method of communication is not working for me, and I need for it to not be driven by me at all times. I do need my supervisor or e-leader to be more hands-on. So in that aspect, I asked, all right, so you have this conflict, you have this tension, you don't feel like there's healthy communication, you don't feel like you're working effectively in these virtual teams because that communication gap is missing. How are you addressing it? And the only way to address it was for the supervisor to, after having had sent that blanket statement out to the employees, to then schedule one-on-ones. So the higher level of satisfaction of working within virtual teams for these federal employees came from employees who were able to establish set times, not necessarily on a weekly basis or even a bi-weekly basis, but something that they could count on. This is my one-on-one time with my boss to talk offline about all my concerns and get my assurances heard. And I need that verbal phone conversation because email is fine, but I need to hear it from him. So it was more of an assurance verbally versus email. It spoke more to their emotional needs, even though they may have understood what was in that email. They're emotionally speaking, they needed to have that verbal conversation to have that assurance. And also, they felt that email, of course, can be just much more cut direct, and something that may appear serious in the tone of an email was subdued and more toned down during alternative methods of communication, and hearing the information more than once, more than twice. Now, for the employees that were feeling micromanaged or felt that their supervisors were, on the flip side, communicating too much through all modes of communication, through that, the follow-up conversations were, all right, this is the primary way that I communicate. So if we're able to connect via email versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 platforms or 5 different ways that you've tried to reach out to me, that's not effective. But I will now hone in on this one and respond to you in a timely manner through whatever their agreed upon platform may be, whether it's MS Teams or email, etc. Now, as far as networking and going back to the relationship development building piece that I spoke to earlier, this one was surprising because folks actually felt, once they had gotten into these virtual teams, they actually said, we actually, specifically women and other women, meaning one participant group, and other minority perspectives, which may not traditionally have been occurred, they were saying, we actually got more networking opportunities than we ever thought would have existed, because now all of a sudden we are able to interact with folks from across the nation and get connected with them on projects that we never had access to in the future, in the past, I mean. So for example, I had a couple of moms who said, you know, Jasmeer, I had travel restrictions, so I wasn't able to travel to XYZ and meet with this person. So I wasn't able to work on this project. But now all of a sudden, these leading officials in a different part of the nation are able to see my work product, are able to hear me, are able to visualize who I'm about, and it actually has led to a promotion. So that was incredibly exciting for me to hear, because it was just completely unexpected research. So the fact that folks are finding, especially groups that whose voices may not have, whose voices may have been more subdued in the past, are finding the virtual platform to be more productive to networking because their voices are elevated. What a great thing to hear. And then as far as the last question, I mean, we asked a bunch of questions and asking, how was conflict managed within virtual teams? Now, folks in which the conflict carried over within the virtual team setting, a lot of these folks had worked in person before, but they had just transitioned over to a virtual platform. So those biases of this person is XYZ were carried on in the virtual platform and also heightened a little bit. And when I asked some of those questions, the responses were, well, honestly, it's easier for me to be more direct in an email. So, you know, with this person, we have our history. Maybe in person, I would have said it differently, but I just get so agitated and I want to make sure I'm documenting everything in email. So I'm covering my bases because, you know, we have a history, and if this person files something in some forum and some action is taken against me, I want to make sure that I'm protected, especially because nobody can see me and witness my work. So I feel like I have to take extra efforts to protect myself. So that was interesting. Now, on the flip side, the other parts of the questions that I asked were, well, how did you address conflict with someone that you've not interacted with, you know, so in person before? And with that being said, typically they said, you know, Jasmeer, if I have conflict with a person in person, I go to that person directly and say, here's my issues. How do we work through this? But they said, virtually I'm finding it hard to build that relationship because I don't have that relationship with them. Now, all of a sudden I'm working on a project with them. Now, all of a sudden I'm expected to build upon the foundation that they've created, but their work product is just so abysmal. Their words, not mine. So I didn't know what to do. I don't feel comfortable going back to this person and saying, I don't understand what you did. It's not right. It's incorrect. Do you even know what you're doing, etc. They're like, I just don't feel comfortable saying these things. It's not my role. It's not my place. So they go, whereas, colleague to colleague, I would have had these conversations one-on-one more informally. I find myself going to my supervisor more. I don't mean to do that, but I don't know how else to handle it virtually. So if a conflict arises in virtual teams, folks reported instances of going to their supervisors more than they would have in person, addressing it colleague to colleague, which I found interesting. And on the flip side, the supervisor would say, these conflicts are coming to me, but I don't know how to necessarily handle it in a virtual setting, because in person, I would just have them sit down face to face and have a facilitated dialogue. What was said was, I find myself accessing my federal government systems more. So if there is a conflict management and prevention center or a mediator present, they find themselves using those tools more and removing themselves from the situation. So as an in-person supervisor, they may have been more mired in the conflict, maybe having a more hands-on approach. But in a virtual setting, there was a heightened desire to maintain neutrality because they recognized that there were more limited opportunities, or what they felt, for relationship development building. So they wanted to sustain their relationships and felt that having third-party neutrals come in and address some of the conflict, what would be more beneficial to the situation, which is also a different way of handling conflict virtually versus in person. And they felt that the third-party mediators were actually great at handling the conflict. Now, whether or not the conflict was truly resolved, I went back and asked the participants, well, did it address your concerns? And I had folks say, well, I'm just going to take it as a learning lesson that now I know what that person's all about, and I'm just going to double check his work, and it is what it is. I had another person say, well, we're actually great friends, and this situation actually helped us build a relationship, and we just kind of laugh it off now. And then I had a third person say, it's nice, but I still don't know what to do in the future. Do I go to that person with my concerns, or do I go to the supervisor? Because I don't want to be running to my supervisor every time that there is a conflict regarding this nature. So how and what conflict was addressed were definitely some varied responses. And the implications of this and the study itself, overall, my hope was that by collecting these narratives and these perspectives from these 25 folks who were interviewed, and you saw the stats earlier, the goal is to help reduce any potential negative impacts, maybe arising from social isolation that they may be feeling, working from home, or work-life dynamics that impact their job. So that's why I do think it is important to engage very specifically and ask virtual teams, virtual employees, e-leaders, non-e-leaders, what is working for you? What is going on? What tools do we need? And still continuing to have those same sophisticated conversations that you would in person, because there are certain things that you cannot lean upon, such as nonverbal body language, or having access to each other, being one room down or one conference room down. So recognizing that we do need to take additional steps to be able to recognize what the needs of the team are, to make sure that we're all meeting the mission. Some references, there was a host of them, but if you're interested, I'd be happy to connect with you offline. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for being present in hearing my data. It was certainly a labor of love, just being able to understand what frustrations, what joys drive folks within virtual spaces. How did they feel like they were being supported? How did they not feel like they were being supportive? What worked, what didn't work from a leadership perspective and from a non-leadership perspective. So with that being said, thank you once again to the National ERA Conference for giving me the platform in which to share this study and some of the things that I've gleaned, and I'll just open the platform up for any questions you may have.
I have laryngitis.
My apologies. If you want to type it out, I can read it.
I would like to type it out. Give me
Okay,
a
great.
moment.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to read the question out. I teach undergrads how to work in virtual teams. What are the top 2 strategies or skills you'd say should be taught? I would say understanding group dynamics theory. So I say that because folks come in with a lot of assumptions. They assume that you have the computer, you have the phone, you have the platform set up, you've worked in a team before, and you know exactly what's going to happen. And that's actually not, even though the same group you have met in person and now you're just transitioning to the virtual space, it's essentially like starting in a new group all over again. So engaging in that perceptions, do you have everything? Do you understand your role? Do you understand how this is going to be different? Are you frustrated? That initial conversation, triaging, I guess you could say, is incredibly important. The second skill I would say is the conflict resolution piece. And this, I would say to your students, is that conflict will arise in a virtual space as it does in person, and offering some tools ahead of time. So what I had mentioned was folks didn't know how to address conflict. Do I go to my colleague, but I've never really met them before, or I feel weird having a phone conversation with them versus meeting with them in person over coffee. So having some conflict resolution skills on, if you are having conflict, you know, how would you address each other? How would you address me? Maybe a few respectful phrases that works for people. So those would be the 2 strategies I'd say, because folks are incredibly intelligent. Everybody's going to get the job done. But what hinders us from getting the job done is our feelings and emotions of how we feel addressed.
Thank you.
Yeah, and great. I mean, they are required to hold a discussion on how they will deal with conflict. So brilliant. Your students are exactly how these federal sector folks were that I engaged with.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. So with that, I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm sure there's other great presentations that you are hoping to jump onto. So I want to say have a great afternoon and nice meeting all of you. So take care.
I just jumped on to see. Good job.
Thank you. And I'll see you at another presentation, Steph. And thank you, Lyra Zoom 4. We'll be signing off now.